Alrighty, welcome to the Rolla Public Library. My name is Derek, and today we're joined by Anders Morley, and we'll be talking about his book titled Land of Snow, A Journey Across the North in Winter. It won the 2021 National Outdoor Book Award in the Journeys category, and we're honored that he is joining us today to discuss his book. And we hope by the time that this interview concludes, you are motivated to read the book for yourself, either by checking it out here at the Rolla Public Library or wherever library that you are, locally in your area, or even purchasing it for your own bookshelf. Now, we are having some technical difficulties, and of course, there's a big storm going on, so this might get a little bit rocky, but we're all going to just try to make it work. And Anders has a really good presentation. I got some questions I prepared for him, and so we're just going to try to have fun with it and see where we can go. How are you doing today, Anders?
I'm doing well, thanks. Great to be here. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about my book.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, you're a dual citizen of the United States and Canada. What are some of the things that you love about Canada?
Um, a lot of things. I mean, obviously to have gone on a journey like this, spending an entire winter outside, traveling on cross country skis. I love open spaces, and Canada has lots of lots of open spaces. So that's a lovely thing. But if we're talking about Canada as a group of people, one of the things that I really like about it is that they're a nation that kind of prides themselves on trying to be kind, which is kind of quaint sounding to a lot of people, but I think it's wonderful, and I think that in general, they do a pretty good job.
Now, what is the scope of the journey described in your book?
Yeah, so my the I should give a little bit of background. When I decided to embark on this journey, I was living in Italy, and I had been living in Italy for close to a decade. I kind of went over to Europe in graduate school just on what was meant to be a short visit to do a language course, an intensive language course. And while I was there, I met an Italian woman, and to make a long story short, we eventually got married. And a few years after I'd initially been there, I found myself living in Italy. But 7 or 8 years into my life there, I started to feel this sort of unease, the sense of homesickness, kind of a claustrophobia, just a generalized feeling of being out of place. And it was in that context that this idea of going on some kind of a long journey, and then eventually a long journey in the winter, occurred to me. I had for a long time been a cross-country skier and loved winter and the outdoors. And so these two things came together, really, kind of by chance, actually, when it really started with this photograph in National Geographic in 2011. That showed a man fording a river in Alaska, carrying a pair of cross-country skis. And something about the picture just jumped out at me. And as I said, I was kind of experiencing this sort of existential crisis. And it was as if the picture were saying to me, this is what you need to be doing. And that kind of planted a seed. And I started to daydream about this idea of going on a winter-long journey on cross-country skis, because it seemed, I guess, kind of the antithesis of everything that I disliked about my life the way it was. And so soon it went from daydreaming to planning, and I eventually hit on the idea of skiing across Canada, and then I started to think more practically about it. What route would I take? What direction would I travel? What kinds of equipment would I use? And then eventually, a year and a half later, November of 2012, it was, I found myself in Vancouver with this huge pile of gear, ready to head north via a series of boats that went up the Inside Passage along the British Columbia coast, almost up to Alaska, and then I started skiing. So once I'd started to think more concretely about the journey and to kind of give it a shape in my mind, I became very interested in exploring the this kind of central belt of Canada, which is often referred to as the near north. It's kind of the boreal forest ecosystem. And I liked it. It interested me because it wasn't like a total wilderness in the way that Arctic or the tundra is in Canada. It was kind of this in-between area where civilization met the wilderness. And so you had little villages, that I expected to come to every week or every few days. And I was interested in seeing how people lived in that world, how they related to this fairly harsh ecosystem and climate.
That's fascinating. You
So
mentioned
yeah,
the well, and you mentioned the kindness earlier. Do you think that kind of maybe that harsh environment inspired the people in those communities to have that kindness?
that's a great question. And yes, I absolutely think that. I was just talking, actually, I had a talk last night and someone brought up a guy who'd spent some time in Alaska talked. I think the term he used was like northern etiquette. I'm not sure if it was northern, but anyway, there's this ethic that exists in places uh, um, where survival is not so easily taken for granted, that you're going to help your neighbors and be basically kind to them. Now, the kind of kindness I experienced was more than just that. I mean, this was like real generosity and charity. It wasn't just pragmatic. But I mean, I think that certainly bolsters it.
Fascinating. It kind of gives us hope too, because it's like during times that are dire, you can that's the time for kindness. It's kind of an interesting idea.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Actually, I mean, I hope that that's something that we can count on.
Now, what motivated you to write about this journey in a memoir style narrative?
Yeah, for a long time I'd wanted to be a writer, really since I was in college, I think. But I wasn't really sure how to go about it, and so I never really made my move. The closest I had come was while I lived in Italy. I worked part time as an English teacher, English language teacher, and part time as a translator. So just translating, I translated some books and whatnot, and that was like the closest I'd come to writing for a living. Um, but I wanted to write something of my own, and so the journey, even before I set off on this journey, I knew that I wanted to write a book about it. Now, the book that I eventually did write was very different, I think, from whatever book I imagined at that time. Um, but in some ways, it kind of seemed like this sort of stepping stone. I was doing something that was very out of the ordinary, and so I hoped that it would become a story worth telling. Um, and then uh, for I mean, I mean, I don't have a problem spoiling too much of the book, but so in the book there's kind of the journey kind of, I mean, in some ways I think it was symptomatic of a crisis in my, or a problem in my marriage, but in another sense it actually sparked to this crisis. And so that is very much part of the story. My marriage went into kind of this downward spiral, and uh, as a result, after the journey, I didn't go back to Italy. I didn't go back to my wife immediately. We were separated for about 5 years, and almost miraculously, it seems to me now, and very happily, we eventually did work beyond our differences and are together again now. But anyway, that was all a result of the journey, and so I include all of that in the story. But my point, where I'm going with this, is during that kind of crisis period, I was living on my own. Especially for the first couple of years, I was kind of wandering around almost kind of aimlessly, just doing odd jobs. And I'd lived in a few kind of remote places in other parts of northern Canada, and then eventually came back to New Hampshire. But it was during that time that I had this realization that, oh, I don't live with anyone else. No one, depends on me for contributing to the household income. I can afford to be a starving artist, basically. And so this is kind of the time to really start pursuing this dream of wanting to write. And so I started pitching, magazine proposals, and had some success. And since then, I've started working, making a living as a writer these past 6 or 7 years.
Wow, that's pretty interesting stuff there. Now you have a background as a literature teacher. Who are some
No, not
literary
lit. Not sorry, not literature. I taught English language.
Oh, English language. I'm sorry. And
Yeah,
then you were also worked as a translator, correct?
yeah,
Okay,
yeah. My
awesome.
background, I mean, my academic background, such as it is in history.
Yeah, but I see. Okay, I gotcha. Um, how I guess then I would ask, how has your understanding of language evolved as you've, taken on this mantle of being a writer and as you've taken on this project of writing your experiences in this memoir?
That's an excellent question, but a very hard one to answer. Um, I think a lot of people think that writers are much more self conscious than they are, and that they understand what they're doing. I mean, maybe some do. I mean, it's like anything. Practice is important, um, but I want to try to say something articulate and hopefully reasonably intelligent in response to your answer. I think that I mean the more I write, maybe the more laid back I become about it.
Mm,
Um, I I don't. It's oh, that's a tough question. Oh my goodness. I think there's I mean, and this is probably says more about my personality than about writers in general. But I think I have kind of like a pedantic streak about me. And I've been, and part of it has to do with my education, which has classical elements to it. Like I've had studied Latin and Greek, and I love sort of old fashioned writers like Henry James and their sort of serpentine Latinate style. But I realize that kind of writing is very out of fashion. But I've spent so much time like in the pages of books like that my writing naturally tends in that direction. And there's an elegance that I admire about it, and probably I mean I try to let it shine through sometimes. But for me, lots of writing, especially like revision, is like a process of reining that in and toning
mm,
and trying to sort of modernize my language. Um, but I think that it's actually the tension between those two things, going for sort of a spare modern style, like people often talk about Hemingway, or as an example of that,
right.
but also trying to get some of the sensibility of those Victorian writers. I mean, it's like a tension between those things, um, that you'll sometimes, it's like striking a chord that has exactly the right tension. And I find that in my writing, that's kind of the sweet spot. At least I think it is.
Fascinating.
That's sort of a vague answer, but I hope.
No,
I
that's
hope.
that's fascinating. Oh yeah, absolutely. Now, in your book, encourages us to think about the natural environment. Who are some environmentalists that you really respect and that you think people should know more about?
All right. Yeah, there's one. I'll say one who comes to mind, who's um, perhaps not as well known as I would like him to be, is a Norwegian philosopher. Actually, he died? I don't know when. Maybe sometime in the last 20 years. And his name was Arne Ness, Arne, and then Ness' last name. Ness is written with in a that ligature in A and an E pressed together. It's a letter that we don't have in English, but and Arne Ness was a philosopher, and he's really associated with this environmental philosophy called deep ecology. And deep ecology calls for sort of a radical, rather than just sort of like putting patches on our environmental problem, really thinking deeply about our relationship to the environment. And like I think that they would even dispense with the idea of an environment, which suggests that we're separate from something. It's surrounded by this thing, and thinking of ourselves as part of this larger system, and a part that's not any more important than every other part. Like everything everything in the environment has, in what we call the environment, has value for its own sake, not just because it's useful to human beings. Um, and so those ideas collectively are often referred to as deep ecology. And Arne Næss, this Norwegian philosopher, was foundational in that movement. And just to give you an example of like his sort of approach to things, he was also an accomplished mountaineer and made several important Himalayan ascents in his younger years. But he eventually came to see like this sort of summit bagging habit of Western mountaineers as kind of symptomatic of this attitude of human arrogance towards the rest of the environment. And so he continued to explore in the mountains, but he started doing these circumambulations. So instead of going up the tops of mountains, he would walk around them and sort of explore the flanks of the mountains without actually going up to the top. And obviously, it's a symbolic gesture, but that's just to give you an idea. So Arne Næss, that's my environmental pick.
Yeah, it's interesting too. The idea of the environment in and of itself. It's not just like, oh, you have this, the environment, and you have the human made. It's, kind of seeing everything as a whole.
Yeah.
And when I was reading your book, I kind of got that idea too, that was something that inspired you, was this idea of people and their environment as a whole.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad I was able to communicate that idea a little bit.
Now, you mentioned in an interview that you'd given, and I was, as I was researching you, that you were brought up in a Protestant Christian household. And I was kind of curious if you could go into how you believe a dogmatic religious upbringing and environment can help one's understanding of the surrounding world and, our place in this environment. And what are some ways where it might limit it? And just in your opinion.
That's a dangerous question. I don't want to offend anyone, but yeah, ways that it can help. I think that if it's done well, that kind of upbringing I think it creates, serious, morally serious people who ask themselves serious questions about, how their behavior affects other people. And some people, stick with the religious answers to those questions, many of which are very good answers. But in other people, it sort of sends them on a different path. But it's a path, that's perhaps equally valid. That's a matter of opinion, but that nevertheless is characterized by that same kind of moral seriousness, or this idea of pursuing something that's that's true, something that's sort of on a higher plane. And it's that, I think it's that upbringing that in a lot of cases is responsible for that sort of sense of concern. Limits. Here, this is, I guess, where you risk offending people. Well, I'll give a sort of simple answer. An obvious limit is that it can sort of, it can be, I guess, a bit, it can be kind of stultifying. It can stop you from asking questions. It can make you, it can make you overconfident in your own view of the world, because if everything is just a matter of belief, and if your belief is based on, something as revealed rather than tested against reality, you become kind of impenetrable to new ideas. So I'll limit myself to saying that I don't want to get in trouble with anyone.
I think that's a great answer, and I think that helps. I think anybody you could listen to that and maybe see that as being an idea. And if we think about some of the major figures from religion, Buddha, Jesus, whoever, I think it's you kind of see there's a humility there and there's a curiosity sometimes. So I think that's an interesting way of answering that question. Now, what do many people misunderstand about the region of Canada in which you journeyed?
Yeah, I think. Well, first of all, I think most people. I don't think most people give it a whole lot of thought, honestly. But I guess I don't know that it's so. I don't know that it's exactly a matter of understanding. I guess it's ignorance. And I say that word, without judgment, just meaning, it's people in the sense that people don't know about it.
Sure.
So I guess one thing is we think of it as pristine often, and it is in many ways, but also like the economy in most of these northern places is driven almost exclusively by the extraction of natural resources. Whether in the case in this particular area, sort of the interior of the Canadian continent, what that means is mining and logging, and of course petroleum extraction, which I guess is a kind of a type of mining. And so that really and I mean, it's possible to travel huge distances through these areas without seeing much sign of that, just because the spaces are so vast. But then when you do see certain areas, it's kind of horror. It's kind of shocking, just because there's this contrast between the pristineness of everything around, and then suddenly, there's just this like really aggressive resource extraction. So that's one thing that I guess you might say is surprising. And then another thing is that I think and this is something that's been talked about more and more very recently, is I think, especially in the US and especially in the Eastern US, there's kind of this idea that the native people of the continent were sort of successfully exterminated. And I mean, I think that the idea a lot of the time is like, it's expressed like in terms of regret, which is good. We should regret the horrible things that we historically we've done to the native people of the continent. But at the same time, there's this risk, and this is what's been pointed out recently. There's this risk of creating this idea that native people don't exist anymore. And so there's not really anything we can do about it. But when you go to the Canadian North, many of the towns that I went to, probably most of them, actually, that's an overstatement. But certainly in Saskatchewan, in particular, the towns that I was in were majority native communities. I mean, we're talking about they're small towns, but like small towns that you have anywhere. That are many of which are thriving native communities, whole sort of networks of Cree and Dene communities, which is, again, to me, a New Englander, usually we learn that there were no Native Americans left in New England by the end of the 18th century. But they're still out there, which is lovely, of course. But there's also lots of talk about racism, and that's become a controversial subject in its own right, which is, in my opinion, kind of strange. But you want to talk about overt racism towards native people, go sometime to the Canadian North, and it's shocking the kind of rhetoric that you hear thrown casually around.
What is something, as you traveled, and it can be either maybe negative, maybe positive, what is something that surprised you about this area of Canada after you had journeyed through it and you had traveled and you'd met people in that kind of an environment?
Yeah, I think I would just reiterate those two things I said. The first thing wasn't so much as a surprise, the fact that there was all this industrial activity, this resource extraction.
Right.
I was aware of that. I guess maybe I wasn't aware of how dependent people are on it for not just their economic livelihood, but with that kind of their sense of. It's just even people who are like, what we think of as progressive, who in urban areas like in southern Canada or in the US, would be kind of vocal opponents of things like, I don't know, the tar sands in Canada. Even progressive people who live there are kind of, I don't want to say blind because that sounds like I'm judging them, but for them it's just kind of part of the reality that they live with, and so it's not this sort of moral black and white the way it is for progressive people elsewhere. So that was kind of a surprise. And then, yeah, like I said, just the sheer, the kind of the continuing vibrancy of native communities in the North, like the fact that there are these large areas that have a thriving native presence that we often think of as, a thing of the past, but it's not.
Mm.
So sorry, I was kind of repeating
Yeah,
the,
no, it's good.
the
Good
same thing.
reiteration. Yeah, good reiteration. Do you what do you believe are some of the biggest lessons you took away as a person? Like, how did this impact you as a person and change the way you view the world?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So again, great question. And I'm glad you asked it, because there's a lot of that book. I mean, a lot of that in the book. Some people see this book, and I think it's partly the way it was marketed. They see it as a book about skiing. Um, and of course, I mean, skiing is in some way central to the book, but it's not really a book about skiing. The idea was to be a book about winter and about the North. It's like a travel book, and as in any good literary travel book, there's always sort of like a personal story to go along, a story of personal development that goes along with the description of the journey. And so I've tried to do that in my book too. And I mean, it was completely accidental, because as I mentioned earlier, this my decision to go on the journey had this devastating effect on my marriage, and it had a very unexpected outcome. So, but by the time I left, I was so fed up with my wife, because she had objected so vigorously to my decision to go on this, and I was stubborn, and was blinded to how selfish it was of me to just kind of want to abandon her for 5 months and expect that would be taken as normal. And then again, I mentioned the reasons for my wanting to go in the first place were just kind of, I was fed up with all the people around me. And so the sum of these two things amounted to this. When I left, I'd become kind of a misanthrope, really. And the journey was also partly about like getting away from people, just because I was sick of society. But along the way, getting back to your opening question, I met just an incredible number of kind and generous, perfect strangers. And so when I thought back on that, when I was writing the book, this sort of sense emerged that these people were, unbeknownst to themselves, they were kind of like drawing me back into the human community and showing me how important human relationships are, and how important it is to not only to care for people, but to allow yourself to be cared for by other people. And so these were all just sort of these little micro instances of that. But what it all added up to show me was that, the most important relationship in my life, the relationship with my wife, was a very valuable relationship, and it was worth fighting for, I guess. And so that's the biggest kind of human lesson that I learned.
Mm.
And it probably sounds obvious to a lot of people, of course, but I think that for the kind of person the kind of person to whom it would occur to go on a journey like this, like these kinds of solitary adventures, I think that we all have kind of a hermit streak in us, and like there's something a little bit off about us. And so maybe, we this kind of lesson is not so obvious to us, but I'm glad I learned it.
Mm. And I just want to bring up to everybody, I've seen people drop in and off as we've been going on. I think there's probably some internet problems here in the Raleigh area. So if you're on, thank you for watching. We're with Anders Morley. He wrote This Land of Snow, A Journey Across the North in Winter. And we're actually been having some technical difficulties, but we're both here. And if you have any questions for Anders, make sure you put them in the comments section. He's got another appointment to meet, so I want to make sure we get him out on time. So if anybody has any questions at all or comments, or just want to say hi, whatever, go ahead and post those now or pretty soon, so that we can make sure Anders can go to his appointment that he needs to go to. And you mentioned the hermit idea, Anders. What do you think? Do you ever foresee yourself like going on another journey like this again? You'd mentioned you're like tired of society, and these interpersonal conflicts. Would you ever see yourself doing this as a different person now, but kind of, yeah, would you ever be like, I need to go on another one of these solitary journeys in the wilderness?
Well, yeah, I mean, I certainly feel the need to go on solitary journeys in the wilderness, but I don't feel the need to do it in the wintertime, certainly. And probably nothing really on this scale. I mean, although I would love to go on a months long journey in the summertime. Um, but it wouldn't be motivate like it's no, I mean, solitude is important to me, no doubt.
Mhm.
But that need isn't motivated by like um, you know, in any kind of dislike of human beings. It's just a realization that, you know, it's a chance to think really, and to just sort of blend into into the world somehow.
Mm.
But a journey like this, no way. I mean, it was incredibly difficult, physically and psychologically taxing. It meant just being, you know, fully alert and working incessantly for 4 months straight. So, and you know, there was lots of misery involved with it in it. I mean, it's not something that I would undo. I'll put it that way, but it's not something that I would redo.
Mm. Makes sense. Can you give us a general idea about the kind of areas you traveled through for this 4-month journey?
Yeah. So I started actually. Let me. I'm gonna shoot through some pictures here to a map. Almost there.
And while Anders is finding that, just want to let everybody know again, be sure to put your comments down in either if you're watching this on Facebook or YouTube, put them in now, and then we can get to them before we end.
All right. So your question was about kind of the geography of my route. So I see. So I ski. My initial plan when I hatched this idea in, you know, in the comfort of my living room, was that I would try to spend this winter skiing all the way across Canada from one coast to the other. And after about 3 weeks on the trail, it became apparent that there was no way I was going to cover that much distance in a single winter. And so at that, you know, and at first I was quite strict with myself about like skiing every inch of the way. But as soon as it became apparent that I wasn't going to make it all the way across Canada, um, my focus kind of shifted to the other facet of the journey, and that was this idea of traveling across winter. Um, and so at that point, like I was less uh, obsessed with the idea of skiing every inch of the way. And so there were a few points on the map where I like jumped ahead. At one point, I took a bus for a couple of hours, and a few other points I accepted lifts from people. Um, and so this is the total journey. It was about 2,000 miles long, of which I skied probably I'm just guessing, in the neighborhood of like 12 or 1,300 miles. And so I started in the west, on the west coast, in the town of Prince Rupert, which you see at the upper left-hand side of the map. And Prince Rupert, like many towns on that places on that northwestern coast, like between Seattle and Juneau, it doesn't really experience a true winter, at least not, certainly not the way that a New Englander thinks of winter. It doesn't really snow very much at sea level, or when it does, it's this kind of an ephemeral phenomenon. And so when I got to Prince Rupert, there was no snow. And so what I did was I freighted my things inland to the next town inland, which is 90 miles east, and it's called Terrace. And there I expected to find winter. So that whole area is very mountainous, and this was early winter, mid-November. And so it was kind of like rainy weather in the 40s, basically low 40s. And what I did was just walked inland to Terrace. And then once I got to that town of Terrace, I had to cross the Coast Mountains. And the Coast Mountains are just the Canadian extension of what we call the Cascade Range in the U.S., the mountains that go from Northern California up into Washington. And so that was a mountainous region. So I had to climb up to this pass. And it was like 100 miles over to go up one side of the pass and then down the other. And it took me about a week. There was really deep snow, and it was physically the most demanding part of the journey. Then after that, there's sort of this rolling hill country that's covered in evergreen trees that goes from there, from the coast mountains to the Rocky Mountains. And so in that area, I was traveling on lots of logging roads. There are thousands of miles of logging roads all over British Columbia. Most of them are not being used actively at any given time. Like they only bother plowing logging roads that are going to be used to take out timber. And so most of them just kind of lie under, there are these single track lines, unimproved roads cut through the wilderness. And they're just lying under a few feet of snow. And so for me, they became perfect trails for covering long distances. And then the Rocky Mountains, of course, another mountain range. And I crossed them in the north at a place called Pine Pass, which is one of the lowest passes in the Rockies. And from that point, I actually started skiing along the railroad, which is surprising to people. But you have to understand that in northern Canada, there are railroads that run in places where there are no normal roads, like automobile roads. So they'll just kind of, they're cargo lines that are connecting one town to another. And if the fastest way is through the wilderness, that's the way they go. And these rail lines are, there's not much traffic on them. A train will come by at most once every 24 hours, sometimes not for 2 or 3 days at a time. And of course, if it snows after a train's gone by, then the rails themselves disappear under the snow. And so I skied for a couple 100 miles that way. And eventually I was in Alberta, which is a flat province. The rest of the way was flat, basically. But much of it was forested. But the difference between Alberta and then the provinces to the east of Alberta is that sometimes I would have to go down onto the prairie. So like flat, but no trees, which I think is familiar to people in your part of the world, or not very many trees. Right. And so, of course, what that meant was exposure to wind. And at that point it was January. So that was really the coldest part of the journey. And then once I got into Saskatchewan, it was February. The days were getting longer, and the second part of the winter was much sunnier. And here, when I hear the word Saskatchewan, it's kind of has the same, like I think of like Kansas north, so I think of like prairie and zero trees anywhere. But in northern Saskatchewan, it's all forested. It's still pretty flat, but there's some rolling terrain and tens of thousands of lakes everywhere. And that's kind of what it was like for the remainder of the journey, like this rolling evergreen tree covered country with lakes everywhere, kind of like Finland, kind of, you would think of. And so those really are the main types of landscape I skied through.
Fascinating. Now, I kind of want to bring when they read your book, this is not really a spoiler, but I kind of want to read a section of the last part of your book because it brings up a point that's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
And is like the concluding paragraph. Part of it said, "When we go to the wilderness alone, we are reminded that our human life is itself just a minuscule facet of the world. We are also reminded, especially if we go into winter, that at some point each of us is going to die. Just as the sense of our own smallness next to the totality of nature can give us an ecstatic sense of participation in the greatness of the whole, the reminder of death built into the cycle of the seasons can sharpen our awareness of being alive." And in your opinion, I wonder if you could go a little bit more into this idea of what is an awareness of being alive? What does that mean to you?
That's another tough one. I mean, it probably means different things to different people. But to me, it means I mean, it means even things like I'll talk about it in a useful way, but even things that are really parts of daily routines, trying not to experience them as routine, like thoughtlessly, just to sort of be conscious of what we're doing. And I think that of course, I mean, we all have bad days and good days and moods and pressures to just get things done and whatnot. But I think sometimes just like stopping and actually sort of allowing ourselves to be absorbed into a moment, even if it's something stupid like, cutting vegetables, or listening to listening to the program on the radio while we're driving, and just really sort of just savoring the moment somehow. I mean, it's hard to explain, um, but it can be immensely satisfying. Even the most prosaic uh, parts of life can take on a kind of poetry. But I think that kind of experience is much easier to have on, a journey. I mean, it doesn't have to be a journey like this, but I mean, just going alone into some quiet, natural space. And it can happen in a cultural space too, like to going alone to an art museum, and just sort of contemplating a painting without any kind of distractions. And I find that I need silence for that. That's really the big thing. Um, uh, and I just think it's immensely satisfying, and I think that it's like medicine in a way. It's healthy. I mean, you come away from an experience like that, hopefully not too far away from it, but return to like distracted life, somehow restored by that experience.
That's really that's an interesting insight into what that means to you. There's actually a musician I know, and he decided to quit his social media. You mentioned the distractions, and he
Yeah.
said he said it was funny because he was somebody who actually he built his reputation as a consequence of YouTube, and he's still keeping some of his YouTube activity, but he's deleted, or he's not deleted them, but he's not active anymore on Facebook or any of these some of these social media sites, and he feels like that we're kind of going along, and we're living in more of a distracted world, and he said he personally kind of felt like it's distracting him from some of the relationships and some of the experiences that actually matter in life. And I'm wondering, and of course, we're talking about technology and social media and all that. Um, do you think that nature is kind of a good remedy to what a lot of people are observing in terms of social media and too many distractions?
Yeah, I do. The problem is that nature has also become sort of like a currency on social media. So that there's this whole phenomenon of people going to, national parks, and like trying to get the best selfie, and then falling off a cliff and dying. That's like the extreme, like, satire worthy example. But going into the whole point of going to nature, as I see it, and it sounds like your friend would probably agree with me, um, is to get away from that stuff. And so I'm not saying don't bring your phone. These things have become indispensable to many people, but um, keep those worlds apart. Realize that they're the value you're going to get out of going into nature is dependent on breaking with that, and being silent and solitude, and getting rid of those distractions, getting rid of this need to exhibit what you're doing to the rest of the world.
Mhm.
Like, here's I mean, go into the natural world and don't tell anyone about it. That should be the that should be the challenge. And this is from the guy who wrote a book about a ski trip. Sorry, it's hypocritical in some way, but
Well, it's a great idea. I'm a master's student in communication, and one of the first exercises I was given in a communication class where I'm using digital media technology to spread messages for brands. One of the first exercises they give you is go a whole day without your phone, or go on a trip without your phone and any kind of technology at all. And they said they want you to, and then we actually had to write an essay about this. What is the experience of doing that? And it occurred to me, I literally walked out of the house to go on one of these walks, right? It's like a day long walk. I went out of the house, and the first thing I did was I patted my leg to see if my phone was in my pocket. And then it did that. Suddenly the power that I was like, you know what? I'm really reliant on this. And
yeah,
as I'm walking, I'm thinking about, oh wow, that's a cool, a bird over there. And I was thinking, oh, that would be a cool picture. And boom, again, I reach for the phone. And
yeah,
we don't even think about it because it's like a habit now. But
No, yeah, it's absolutely true. And I mean, and even older people, who grew up in a world without these things have become reliant. And even some, like, I'm kind of like a techno skeptic Luddite sort of person, but even, I mean, I'm totally dependent on the thing. And I when I go for hikes, usually I try to leave as much as possible to leave my phone at home and to not take pictures. If I can, I mean, unless I have a good reason for wanting to take a picture beforehand. Um, but often, yeah, I find myself doing that same thing, patting, patting my leg, kind of instinctively.
almost like, yeah, it's like, because I pat to see if my keys are there, and then I pat to see if my phone is there, and it was just because it's just that the idea of the assignment was to do that too. Was it was like, you're in this society where this is a normal thing, where people aren't even thinking about it, and I guess would you say you mentioned you were a skeptic as we start kind of wrapping up. What do you think this book can do in terms of, or do you think this book can do anything in terms of helping people to rethink their relationship with, and when I say environment, I just mean like their surroundings.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you think it can make them experience their surroundings in a more deeper way?
I mean, I hope so. But it's I didn't set out to write a self help book or anything, like a book of advice. I mean, I hope that what people take most of all will take, because I'm trying to write in a kind of a literary voice. So I hope that it just delights people in some way, or that they think, oh, that was a good story. That's my first hope. But of course, as a person, as a moral agent in the world, and not so much as a writer, um, I like to think that some of the, like, insights that occurred to me as a consequence of going on this journey, about relating to winter landscapes in particular, and living in a way that makes that is more respectful towards the environment, the specific environments that we associate with that time of year, that will get people thinking about just about how they um, experience winter.
Mm.
So that's a very vague, but I guess, I mean, I just hope it gets people thinking.
Mm. Thinking is often where it all starts. Now, all sorts of people come into the library. Not today, of course, because we are closed. Just anybody watching, I'm from home right now, so don't go out unless you need to. But when we are open, all sorts of people come into the library. And we all have different goals and different interests and different things we are inspired to do. What is some general advice you would give to somebody who has an idea of, I want to go do an adventure, and maybe a lot of people don't understand it, but I want to do it. What's the piece of advice you would give to them?
Um, I mean, are you talking about, like, just are you talking about like a major expedition kind of adventure like this,
Yeah,
or just?
yeah, exactly. It could be a journey. Maybe, let's say somebody wants to write a book. Let's say, and a lot of people are like, oh, you shouldn't write a book. Or let's say somebody wants to start a charity in their community. Somebody senses something. There's something about society that needs to be changed, or there's something they don't like, and they're responded. They're motivated to do something about that in some way, and what they want to do, they personally consider it a journey of some kind. What's that kind of piece of advice you would give to somebody who's thinking about, there's something I want to do, there's something I feel like I need to do?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the my answer is kind of an obvious one, I suppose. And um, but I mean, do it. Like, right, instead of thinking about it. I'll quote one of my favorite authors, who's Annie Dillard. She once said, how we spend our days is, of course, how we spend our lives. So if you want to do something, start now, and start doing it, spending as much time as you can doing it. Um, and of course, we all have limitations and other demands that are put on our time by other people. But you know, you have to, if you really want to do something that badly and not just talk about it, you have to get your priorities straight, and then put your, what's the expression, your nose to the grindstone or whatever it is. Yeah.
Great. That's great advice. As we kind of conclude up here, what is one important thing you hope readers will take away, or what is one thing that you wished I would have asked you about your book? Not to put you on the spot there, but what's something that you're hoping people would take away from it, or that you don't think, something you would like to add to what we talked about today?
I mean, so the second part, something I wish you'd ask me. I don't have. I mean, I think you had great questions. So can't think of anything that I would add there. I mean, I think that every question is subjective, and so I'm not going to try to tell you what you should have asked me. But what's something people take away from the book? That's a tricky question again, because I'm not trying to. I wasn't trying to write a book that tells people what they should or shouldn't do. My biggest wish for the book, honestly, is that again, that people will read it and think that was a nice story, or that passage was well written, that was some pretty writing. I mean, my ambitions with the book are mostly are artistic, really. But that said, again, there is kind of this environmentalist moral vision that I hope finds more traction in the world. And if my book can in some way contribute to that, then I'm glad. But it wasn't my goal. Let's put it that way. So my biggest hope is that people will just delight in the book and think it's a good story and well told.
Well, and that's an excellent way to write a memoir, and that's an excellent reason to read a memoir. So I think that's fantastic. Now, where can people check out your book? Where can they learn more about you? If they were to want to add this book to their collection, where would they go find it?
Yeah, so it's available. Lots of libraries have it, not all of them, but it's available through online book vendors, such as there's a famous big one that starts with the letter A that I won't name. But then, of course, my preference would be for you to buy it from your local independent bookseller. But there's also an audio version, I should say, which is available on Audible, but also through Hoopla and other library audiobook services. And it's read not by me, but by a professional audiobook reader. So if you're a commuter and listen to audiobooks a lot, that's an option. I think that the reader does a pretty good job. It's always strange to hear someone else reading your words, but so those are really the two options. But it is available, distributed nationally, so shouldn't be hard to find if you want it. If you want to read, give it a read.
Great. Well, Anders, thank you for making time to talk with us today, and thank you for braving all these weird technical things. I've given quite a few interviews, and this has been one of the most difficult from a technical point of view, but I enjoyed the conversation. I hope you've enjoyed it as well.
I have. Thank you. Thank you for your thoughtful questions.
You're absolutely welcome. And just to let everybody know here, as Anders said, it's available at many bookstores, including local ones, if you're interested in buying it. We also have it at the library. It's currently in cataloging, so it should be on the shelves very soon. And of course, if it gets checked out, you guys know, give us a call, and one of us will be able to help put that on hold for you. So great book. I encourage you to read it. And Anders, thank you so much for taking some time today to talk with us about your book.
Thank you, Derek. It was my pleasure.